Margo Anderson is a science editor and trans woman in East Hampton, Massachusetts. She no longer lives her life as a secret, but during the 4 decades that she did.
I would say for me, there were kind of 2 phases of secret keeping.
The first phase started when she was 3 in the early 1970s, living in Brunswick, Maine.
I was assigned male at birth, and I told my mother there's been a mistake. I'm a girl.
Her mother did not react well. She dismissed the statement and told Margo she shouldn't bring it up again. Margo describes her mother as a frustrated performer who had to put aside her own artistic dreams to be a housewife. But instead of supporting Margo, it was
more like, that's life, kid. I didn't get to be who I was either. So really the secret for a long time was the secret I kept from myself.
When Margo was very young, the secret was bearable because the male hormones hadn't yet started kicking in. That happened in adolescence.
And then it was like, oh my God, what is this? Like every day, and it never stopped, and it's never ending. And it's just like, God, can I get a moment of silence? No, the answer is no, you can't get a moment of silence. I was stuck with this body that was giving my head the wrong chemistry. Nothing ever worked.
She now knows that feeling was the result of gender dysphoria, but for many years it was just a constant physical and mental disconnect. She calls it an emotional tinnitus.
It was this sort of subsonic humming or buzz that you always experienced.
On the few occasions that she would share these feelings with her friends and peers, Margo only got laughter and derision.
And they responded exactly as I expected it. Oh, that's absurd. How could that possibly be true? So you kind of respond to the social cues that you're given.
To center herself, Margo threw herself into music that resonated with her confusion, like Prince's Purple Rain album, which included the song I Would Die For You.
Lyrics like, I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I am something that you'll never comprehend.
I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I am something that you never understand.
And she became obsessed with certain movies, like The Who's Quadrophenia.
It's these movies and these music and this art that, spoke to kind of a kid who didn't know her identity.
So she kept the secret from herself and her family for decades, until a revelation hit her one afternoon while she was out doing errands.
And it was like, oh my God, this is not complicated at all. There's nothing. Here I spent my entire life thinking this is so complex and so, impossible for me to ever understand. And it was just like, no, it's not hard to understand at all. I'm trans, that's all. It's that simple. It's as simple as what I said when I was 3. I'm a girl.
And that's when her second phase of secret keeping began. This is episode 2 of The Secrets We Keep, a podcast from NEPM about the stories we don't tell, what they say about our world, and what they do to our minds. I'm Karen Brown. In this episode, we explore secrets of the closet and how people who identify as LGBTQ have been forced to keep quiet about core truths that people who are straight or cisgender often take for granted. We'll get back to Margo's story, but first.
Hi. She's very excited. She'll chill out.
Yeah, hi. Who's this again?
This is Ruby.
Abbie Goldberg and her dog invite me into their Northampton, Massachusetts home, where, as Ruby settles, I peruse Abbie's bookshelf.
We have some interesting books here. Unsolved Deaths, Strange Deaths and Mysterious Disappearances.
I like kind of gory stuff, so.
Abbie is a psychology professor at Clark University in Worcester, who focuses on the experiences of gay and lesbian, adoptive, and diverse families. She began her academic research in the mid-2000s, interviewing young adults with a gay parent.
I was interested in how they made decisions about who they decided to tell and reasons for kind of disclosure and non-disclosure.
Like many people who devote their life's work to a focused set of questions, Abbie has a related history of her own.
I was raised in part by a queer single mom. My parents divorced when I was 9 years old, and my mother partnered with somebody who became a significant part of my life for the next 10 or so years.
For most of her adolescence, Abbie never spoke about her mother's relationship.
I mean, it was really an unspoken secret. You know, we knew my mom had a partner, we knew that they were together, but we didn't talk about it in that sense. She was my godmother. She was my, my mother's quote-unquote best friend.
It was the 1980s, during the AIDS crisis and the conservative politics of the Reagan era. At the time, Abbie was uncomfortable talking openly about her mother's sexual orientation. She didn't even have a vocabulary to describe her situation. She has since interviewed hundreds of other people with similar stories from the same period.
I think sometimes we don't even know we're keeping secrets when we're keeping a secret, especially when it's normalized. You know, what's not normalized is actually talking about this stuff.
As Abbie was growing up in New York, her mother's relationship only felt like a secret when she had to actively conceal it, like when her friends came over to the house or when her mother's partner would visit her summer camp for a performance.
So there were situations where I had to kind of develop a plan for how I was going to talk about her and her role and her relationship to my family and my life.
Abbie was an outgoing, assertive teenager, and she sometimes resented her much quieter, private mother for putting her in that position. But that didn't happen often, and in retrospect, Abbie considers her mother incredibly brave to have gotten divorced to live a more authentic life, even if she didn't feel she could talk about it openly. She only explicitly told Abbie she was gay when Abbie was about 16.
She said something about, that, this person is my partner. And of course, I did know, but it was the first time she put words to it. And I think by then, again, things had really shifted too. You know, it was the mid-90s and things were changing. But ultimately, she spent a lot of years not talking about it.
So is that silence necessarily bad? Abbie says that depends who else is affected.
If they live alone and they don't have relationships with very many people, it doesn't affect a lot of people, right? It affects them. And I guess to some extent, how bothered they are by that depends on, how much they want to have a truly integrated life. Do they want everyone in their life to know certain basic things about themselves?
Years later, Abbie interviewed her mother about this time for a college essay and asked her point blank, "Why did you keep your gayness a secret?" Not surprisingly, it came down to society's opinions.
I think she was fearful. I think she eventually came out to certain extended family members and didn't get the greatest reception.
That makes Abbie sad, especially because she grew up in a more accepting generation around LGBTQ identity, at least where they lived in the Northeast. And Abbie has made a point of raising her own child in a supportive climate around gender and sexuality. But she knows not all kids have it easy.
There are definitely ways in which it's still, things are not okay, depending on maybe if you're attending a religious school or you live in a religious community. There's still there are a lot of risks for both parents and for kids being out.
Bill Hudson grew up in Minnesota in the 1980s and tried not to think about why he felt so different.
Growing up Catholic, you couldn't really entertain the possibility of being gay.
He says his mother would often make disparaging remarks about flamboyant gay people they passed in the shopping mall. By the time he entered high school and college, he started to have romantic feelings towards other boys and young men. But he understood he could not acknowledge them to himself or anyone.
I identify a lot with the musical Book of Mormon, where the song, Turn It Off.
When you start to get confused because of thoughts in your head,
it was just something that I was able to compartmentalize, that I could put in a box and put it away.
Turn it off like a light switch, just go click. It's a cool little
Bill spent 3 years in seminary school before deciding to take a job in the Twin Cities at a Catholic high school. It was an institution that definitely would not have tolerated a gay teacher.
That's the point where the professional and the personal really began to separate out.
He did not predict how excruciating that would be. He couldn't talk to anyone at work about his sexual orientation. He would prepare himself every morning for a double life.
Leaving myself in the car and being able to, and needing, when I walked into school, to keep that part hidden and separate and begin to edit what I did for the weekend.
Like if he went tubing down the river with friends, he couldn't share that.
Because I was afraid of the second and the third question. And I would not use pronouns. I wouldn't even talk about dating.
And while his colleagues became friends with each other,
I would not socialize with people at work. I was there at 7:30 and I walked out the door at 4 or what have you, and I would not do too much conversation around the coffee pot or in the faculty lounge.
this went against his naturally extroverted personality. He would have loved to get to know the people he worked with. Still, he could manage the disconnect fairly well until the day he walked into a country western bar.
Growing up, my mother would always say that you're never going to meet a nice girl in a bar. But I didn't. I met a nice boy in a bar.
His name was Ross, and they fell in love. Ross was out in his professional life, and his family was very accepting. But he accommodated Bill's need to keep their relationship hidden. In public, they both went into secrecy mode.
I got good at kind of scanning a crowd to see if I would, see somebody from school, somebody from my professional life. He could sense that, and he would just step back as though we weren't side by side. If we were walking to the mall or at the state fair or someplace, in a public setting, he would just kind of fade off to the side.
At the time, Bill didn't fully appreciate how one secret, his secret, had tentacles that reached into other people's lives. And even though Ross went along with it,
I did not realize what I was asking of him.
But Ross hung in there, and the relationship deepened, as did the secret keeping.
We moved in together, all those steps as our relationship progressed, that emotional, physical, it began to just increase exponentially.
That stress was never over the fact he was gay. Bill says he was always comfortable with who he was.
I knew that God loved me as I was. I had more shame about hiding Ross or hiding my life from my friends and preventing a relationship with friends from deepening because I had to hold back. And so I did feel shame and guilt about that.
This may be a good place to step back and talk about the toll of secret keeping on a person. As I was reporting this podcast, I met a social scientist at Columbia University named Michael Slepian. He's one of the country's premier researchers on the psychology of secrets.
The hard part of having a secret is not that we have to hide it, but that we have to live with it.
Slepian has written papers about the physical burden of secrets, the actual weight that people feel in their bodies having to withhold information from other people. He discovered that the act of hiding the truth is not the heaviest part. It's the rumination.
It's the more we think about our secrets, that our secrets hurt us the most.
In Slepian's research, he found 38 main categories of secrets, from infidelity to committing a petty crime. And he learned that the average person keeps 13 of them at any one time. Slepian interviewed hundreds of people about their secret keeping, and they said it really wasn't that hard not to trip up. Like in Bill Hudson's case, he just didn't bring up his personal life with coworkers and neighbors. But Slepian says that can still be incredibly isolating. He's written about famous secret keepers like government whistleblower Edward Snowden, people who spent months or years in fear, knowing big things they couldn't even tell their closest loved ones. He wrote about one woman who had accidentally smothered her own baby when she was a teenage mother. She only found relief when she confessed 5 decades later after a chance encounter with a police officer.
And I think it just reveals something about what it means to be human, like just a thought it can feel hard to be alone with.
And that's where the shame comes in. Like Bill Hudson said, he wasn't ashamed of being gay. He was ashamed he was keeping his relationship hidden. Slepian says that's the part that can ruin people's mental health.
Feeling shame is really one of the worst emotions you can feel in terms of your health and well-being. When people feel ashamed, they feel small and worthless and powerless to change. Those are feelings that make it hard to cope with anything.
So let's get back to Bill. While he appeared to be an emotionally distant bachelor to the people at his Catholic school workplace, he was actually living with Ross, deeply in love, and they decided to adopt 2 children from Guatemala.
That also then became a secret that I had to keep. Not that I had children, but that people at work, at school, thought I was a single parent, which added a whole nother layer of cognitive dissonance and, guilt and shame and about not being able to share that part of who I was.
While the children were very young, it wasn't that hard to keep the family structure a secret. He made sure the only family photos on his desk were of the children alone. Their conversations in public were simple and didn't involve discussions about the family. Until one day, when the kids were 5 or 6, and he brought them to his school.
They referred to Ross as Daddy in third person, which was very awkward because then I had to, pivot the conversation away from that. That was probably the moment that I realized that this secret keeping could not continue. I couldn't ask them. I was, asking too much of Ross. I was not willing to continue to live that secret.
At about this time, the Catholic leaders in his region were becoming more conservative and more publicly anti-gay. So Bill began to look for a new job at a different school. And during that process, someone figured out his secret. He was confronted by a board member at the school where he worked, who asked him straight out, "Are you gay?"
I often talk about that as kind of my life flashing before my eyes. I'm thinking, what do I do? If I say yes, I know I'm going to lose my job. There was so much fear about that, loss of job, loss of identity, the reputation that I had built. And if I denied it, that would be the final straw in losing myself.
So he told them yes, he was in a committed relationship with a man. As expected, they demanded his immediate resignation. He was willing, as long as the board agreed to tell the staff why. Bill didn't want people to think he was guilty of a crime or financial wrongdoing. The board sent out an internal memo explaining Bill was gay, and someone sent that memo to the press.
Which then, made it on the front pages of the newspapers and the evening news as well.
That was 2013. At first, it was upsetting to have his private life and one-time secret splashed across the headlines. The outing was not his choice. But it became a blessing in disguise. Now that he was famously unemployed, those who supported gay rights reached out to him, including the board of Mounds Park Academy, where he is now head of school. He remembers his first day when one parent got out of her car at drop-off.
Came up to me and gave me a big hug and said, "I am so glad you're here." And that was one of those moments that it was like a whole nother world.
The political climate around sexual orientation has also changed since those days, at least in many places, with gay marriage now legal on a federal level. For Bill, even aside from politics, living a life without that big secret has been revelatory. He can reclaim his extroverted personality. He can make friends at work.
There's a lightness and step and in feeling that it's just not something that I have to keep secret.
But he no longer considers himself a Catholic. He only goes into a Catholic church now for weddings.
I think it does trigger. There's probably, some PTSD associated with it, but it's also a realization that, I do believe in God, that I am loved, I'm worthy, I have dignity, that, is not defined by my orientation.
So let's return to Margo Anderson, the science writer in Western Massachusetts. As you may recall, she struggled with gender dysphoria that for years made no sense to her but caused her immense pain.
It would be like this sort of chorus, like way in the distant background in your head, that's like saying, you're female, you're doing it wrong. Like almost self-destructive kind of emotional self-destructiveness that is, it's ruinous.
Margo identified as male into her 40s. She married a woman named Penny in 1998 and very slowly began to figure things out. By 2014,
I remember that issue of Time magazine with Laverne Cox on the cover that said the transgender tipping point. I was ashamed to buy that magazine because it's like, what would that say about me?
But when her children were in elementary school, everything changed. Margo remembers the exact day in 2015. She was waiting to mail a package at the post office where a song was playing over the loudspeaker.
And I'm a creature of pop music, there's a wonderful song by Sarah Bareilles called Brave. I might cry. Let your words be anything but empty. Why don't you tell them the truth? It's a song about coming out.
Why don't you tell them the truth?
That time was the time that pushed me over the, I was primed, I was ready. It probably wasn't a week or two after that I was contacting my old therapist and was like, okay, I think we need to start obsessions again.
She realized with utter clarity she was a trans woman. She told her wife Penny, who was very supportive, but it would take another 7 years for her to come out to everyone in her community. And during that period, she essentially kept her gender identity a secret again.
I look back on that sad woman who was just trying to get through day to day, in her stupid janitor's outfit is what it felt like. It's just like this, whatever. Not that I have problems with jeans and t-shirts, but I just mean like that, it's just this sort of drab guy's look.
But this time at least, she knew the secret would have an expiration date. She just needed time to get ready.
I mean, I'm going to be coming out as a late 40s or early 50-something woman whose peers have had an entire life's experience of being girls and women. I'm a woman without a girlhood.
So she'd have to create her public-facing womanhood from scratch. That meant buying new clothes, working on her voice, learning how to apply makeup.
I also had a testosterone-mediated adolescence and young adulthood, which means I have very masculinated features, and I have to learn to kind of work with that and overcome that.
And there was something even more basic and foundational. Before she could introduce her new self to people, she had to find her own name.
I went through a lot of different names and none of them really fit until I came upon Margo, and it was like, Margo was just perfect. It was like, yeah, that's it. That's totally it.
Unlike Bill Hudson, who'd been forced to reveal and confront his secret publicly and suddenly, Margo could be much more intentional. She brought in friends slowly, depending on how close they lived or what made sense to their relationship. She started taking hormone replacement therapy in 2021, which helped speed up the physical process of coming out. But she also had to think practically. How would the revelation affect her life and that of her children?
Because it wasn't just about me, it was also about my family, and I wanted my kids to have their space, and if they were going to have issues, I wanted to sort of give them time to work on their issues.
And that meant a long lead up, learning the skills she needed to come out before she was ready to tell people, living half in and half out of the closet. Like on the days she would come home from a lesson on applying cosmetics, sitting in her car and feeling like she had to put her male mask back on.
With the makeup remover wipes or whatever, just, peeling it all off and just like looking in the rear view mirror of my car and just going like, oh God. I mean, I got to do it, but it's the come down of like, I was there for a brief fleeting couple hours.
Then there was her professional identity. She'd been a freelance writer for many years, but while she was transitioning, she got a job as an editor at a New York-based publication. She was hired during COVID, so the work was initially remote, and she kept coming up with excuses to put off actually coming to the office.
You don't want to have your first physical impression face-to-face with people being like the disguise.
Eventually, she was ready to unveil herself at work and everywhere.
Okay, so this was an email I sent in July to a number of, these would be parents of friends of my kids. Let's see, it was hoping you're enjoying a fun and productive summer. As parents, we've gotten to know one another over.
She hired a photographer to take pictures of herself looking glamorous in a blue gown and makeup, and attached that to the email.
I have some news, and the news we have to share, in fact, Penny and I think calls for something closer to a celebration, because I'd like to actually reintroduce myself. My name is Margo, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Then she invited them to her coming out party in September of 2022, on the year anniversary of starting to take hormone replacement therapy. She rented out a concert hall, she bought a new dress, and curated a playlist for dancing with songs that were both festive and meaningful. Most were mashups of at least 2 different songs, symbolizing the melding of 2 worlds.
I mean, I just remember getting home and just thinking, like, I just lived a fairy tale. And I just remember being in absolute tears about the realization that I've just, lived this kind of, again, I'm a woman without a girlhood, so I never had, many women, when they were very little, they went through, a princess phase or whatever. I just had my princess phase, just, in one night. It was amazing. 'Cause somewhere in the crowd there's you.
Margo's life is so different now.
I'm a very social person. I'm an extrovert, but that has really only come to prominence since I've kind of come into my centered, gendered self.
Her core identity is no longer a secret. But that's not to say life as a trans woman is always easy. She gets looks, she gets misgendered, especially at fancy parties or official events. And her joy at living authentically is often marred by the realization that many other people have to stay in the closet. Not because they want to live a secret, but because they feel they have to.
I'm speaking from a place of great privilege and luxury here in a very welcoming part of a very blue state that, has a trans-affirming, state policy. There are parts of this country that it is very hard, and they're making it harder still to be trans, especially for trans young people. It's almost a dangerous proposition, and it's becoming more dangerous as some of these laws, and some of these bills, again, promulgated in a climate of ignorance and fear.
So much of LGBTQ secret keeping comes from being othered, feeling separate from what are considered more traditional genders or orientations, non-queer, straight, cisgender, and the accompanying pressure to justify your place in the mainstream. So what happens when you are othered in more than one way?
I've never been pulled over for being gay, but I've been pulled over for being Black.
Tanisha Arena is a community activist and nonprofit leader in Springfield, Massachusetts. She has felt that pressure as a Black professional woman who also identifies as lesbian.
When I think about the pieces of my identity, Blackness is first. You could make me the freest gay person, but I'm still Black.
Tanisha was in her 20s, married to a man, when she realized she was gay and wanted out of her marriage.
I had little kids, and I remember being terrified, oh my gosh, we're going to go to court and, they're going to take away the kids and they're going to give them the kids because I'm gay. Oh my gosh. And just being terrified.
But early on, she learned there was much more support than she realized, like when she came out to a coworker.
And we're in her office and sweat pouring and I'm so nervous. And she was like, what? And she asked me if I killed somebody. And I was like, no, I'm gay. She was like, oh, girl.
She went on to find acceptance within her extended family. and then finding a community of like-minded queer women. Ever since then, she's never felt the need to keep secrets about her queerness, nor, of course, is she able to keep secrets about her Blackness. But there are other things she feels she can't be totally open about as a result of both those identities.
For me, there is the expectation when I go out in the street or out into places that the bullets and daggers are coming, right? So I put on my strongest armor, and what I'm looking for is a soft, safe place to land where I can take that armor off at the end of the night or the end of the week. But I still have to go in that space, because what happens in the absence of our voices in those spaces?
I look up to Tanisha a lot because she is just like, I don't know if I need to censor myself or not. No. Okay. She is out as fuck. So it's just like.
Nicole Young Martin is also a queer Black professional based in Western Massachusetts.
I grew up in a very conservative church. Very conservative. And so that was a space where we definitely kept secrets, because the Bible and what people interpreted dictated everything that we did.
She came out as queer in her 30s, about 10 years ago. Now she is a theater educator, writer, and poet. And as a leader in nonprofits, she does still feel like she has to keep parts of her personal life secret.
There's a certain ideal that people have for who should lead organizations and for who should run for public office. My mom would always say, when she was alive, Nicole, you should run for public office because you're great at advocating for people. And I said, I don't want to have to hide my Netflix queue. I don't want to have to straighten my hair. Yeah, I don't want to have to Kamala Harris myself in order to run for office.
And while a white straight person may get away with certain edginess, Nicole says a Black queer woman with power just doesn't have that luxury. She must be unassailable.
I would have to cover up my tattoos. I would have to cut my nails down. I would have to straighten my hair. I also would have to be very careful of the rhetoric that I say.
I understand what Nicole's talking about.
This is Tanisha again.
This conformity, and this is the palatable diversity, right? Sure, yeah, as long as you don't disrupt the status quo. And I think intentionally go into spaces to disrupt the status quo.
This ties in with Clark Professor Abbie Goldberg's research into LGBTQ families, especially adoptive parents, that some of the most common secrets they keep are not about their sexual orientation, but about other challenges, like mental health struggles or addiction or even divorce, things that might cause their parenting skills to be questioned more than quote-unquote traditional families.
It's understandable, and it continues to perpetuate, I think, a myth that these things don't exist. If folks are not talking about mental health issues, or they don't really want to accept that this is what's going on, that's going to limit that family's ability to get the kinds of services and supports that they need.
Not to mention the effect it may have on the children themselves.
I think that you internalize that sense of shame. There is something fundamentally wrong with me. People knowing about this would mean that something's wrong with me. This would reflect bad on my family.
But this also brings up for me a question I've asked myself since starting this podcast. When is keeping quiet about your struggles or joys a matter of secrecy, and when is it just privacy?
You could argue that secretive only comes into play when someone else is asking questions, right? You're private until somebody's inquiring, and then you're secretive because you're not willing to share.
Tanisha and Nicole told me they dispensed with their secrets early and prefer to confront society's prejudices head-on. In the cases of Bill Hudson and Margo Anderson, they were both craving the chance to share core parts of themselves, but felt forced to keep those parts secret. But all of them told me some things in confidence, things they asked me not to broadcast in this story. They have their reasons. The difference is that now they get to make that choice. You've been listening to episode 2 of The Secrets We Keep, a podcast about the stories we don't tell, what they say about our world, and what they do to our minds. It's a production of NEPM, written and reported by me, Karen Brown, edited by Sam Hudzik, music by Katie Semro. Next episode, we'll look at abortion secrets, how the changing political and legal winds of the past half-century have forced women to keep quiet about their abortions and also inspired them to speak out.
So here I was, this high-performing kid, suddenly bringing down catastrophe upon the house. I just couldn't.
It's protective not to speak out. But on the other hand, it's rooted in self-blame and blaming the victim.
When Roe v. Wade was overturned, I was so mad I wanted to hold up a sign in the middle of the street and say, I've had an abortion or two, and if you don't like that, you can go F yourself. And I drafted a post on Facebook, and I showed it to a friend of mine. She's like, you might want to just take a day before you post that. And I was like, yeah, you're right.
That's next on The Secrets We Keep. Thank you for listening.